Hi, I'm Parker J. Cole, and I'm so excited to share with you my very first chapter read selection. This whole series is intended to introduce you to me as an author as we travel through time as I go through all the books I've published since 2010. I'm really excited to share and go on this journey with you. I'm looking forward to learning about myself, to see how I have grown, if my writing has changed, and just give you some behind the scenes of all the books I've been blessed to publish within this 12-year period. And I hope you'll join me along for the ride. Each time I upload one of these, I'll be reading the first chapter, and then I'm going to give you some behind the scenes about each book. So I hope you'll be with me. We're going to go ahead and listen to the first chapter read of my very first published novel called Dark Cherub. Shadows lurk in the darkness, preying on hundreds of women who have one hidden thing in common. A young woman witnesses the unsettling disappearance of her high school principal and soon finds herself facing a harrowing decision. Two friends find themselves facing a power that threatens not only their lives, but the lives of thousands more. One is fighting her own shadows from past decisions. The other is followed by a lurking adversary who nearly killed her 5 years before. She begins to connect a series of events, and a frightening realization comes to light. They face a power that cannot be fought with guns or weapons. Will they find the answers and the strength to cast away the grip of a hostile presence that only wants them dead? Please enjoy this first chapter read of Dark Cherub. Dark Cherub. Prologue. Inky black shadows, the width of a thread, wormed their way across the concrete. The night veiled their presence, making them imperceptible to the naked eye. Mutely, they wended their way toward her as she briskly walked through a nearly vacant parking lot. She passed under the light of a lone lamppost. As they drew closer, the shadows merged with the concrete. She was unaware of the shadowy black splotches swiftly approaching. At the edge of her shoes, they disappeared from the surface of the concrete. She began to feel an uncomfortable sensation along the inside of both feet. Trekked up her leg. When it began to crawl over her body, she dropped her purse. She looked down. Black splotches moved vertically on her body. At the exact moment that she would have screamed, one of the splotches entered her mouth, covering her tongue in a black film. No sound issued from her mouth. The sensation morphed. It was as if she was being stabbed by thousands of ants. Black splotches covered her arms, her legs. Were they on her face too? Then, as the soundless scream continued, the splotch-covered woman vanished. In the place where she stood, a whisper caressed the night. Mother. It seemed like a good idea at the time. Heavy petting had led to something more feverish, and overwhelmed with their sensations and the heat of the moment, the two young people didn't stop themselves or each other. It was in what they had assumed to be an abandoned parking lot that Angela Peters went ahead and did something she vowed she would never do before marriage. Exhaling afterwards, she glanced out of the rear window as the steam produced by the brief moments of passion began to clear. Angela always loved gazing at the moon. Though the sun hadn't fully set, she could clearly see that the craters of the moon were stark and more pronounced than usual against its golden surface. Beside her, Derek Hunter still panted. His heartbeat raced against her palm as it rested upon his warm, bare chest. Angela pushed him away. Let's get out of here before somebody comes. He swore a protest. She insisted, Come on, let's get out of here. She fumbled about, straightening her clothes. When Derek protested again, she insisted, I don't know what we were thinking. What if someone catches us? Oh man, I would just die. When Derek grunted but said nothing more, Angela focused her attention outside the steamy vehicle once more, this time to check if anyone was coming. Derek finally began to rearrange himself when, to Angela's horror, he saw a woman walking toward the car. We've got to get out of here. Somebody's coming. As they both scrambled about, the woman passed beneath the lamppost. Suddenly she stopped. Had the woman seen them in the car? No. Something else. What was happening? Derek. Angela reached for him once more. His hand looked suddenly icy. "What the?" he croaked. Black splotches appeared on the woman's legs and crawled up, out from beneath her collar, her neck, and onto her face. She dropped her purse, her mouth open. She was screaming, and yet neither of the young people could hear a sound, and then she vanished. "We've got to get out of here." Derek's voice broke the stunned trance. A few seconds later, they were speeding out of the parking lot and onto the local highway. Angela began to shake from a delayed reaction at the chilling sight. "Derek!" Derek stared at the road ahead, but his hand trembled on the steering wheel. "Don't want to talk about it, but I don't know what just happened, all right? Let's just forget it," Derek snapped. He was a tall, good-looking guy with deeply tanned skin, dark curly brown hair that came to the tip of his collar, a lean but muscular body from his workouts as a basketball player, and light green eyes. Yet at this moment he didn't look good to her at all. His nostrils flared out, and a scowl appeared on his face. His hands clenched and unclenched the steering wheel, as his foot remained heavy on the pedal. "As far as I'm concerned, I didn't see a thing, and neither did you." Angela nodded and hugged her body. Silence ensued as they continued driving down the highway. At the next intersection, Derek turned right and headed toward a well-lit area that housed the Hudsonville Public Library. A small number of cars in the parking lot gave evidence to the fact that they were near closing time. Derek drove around to the back of the building, as he always did after their clandestine meetings. With the car in neutral, Angela sat there, the images of the evening imprinted on her mind. "Derek." "No, Angela, now just shut up." His face was scowling again, eyebrows furrowing as he narrowed his eyes at her. They were so cold. Angela gulped for a moment with unease, the cold feeling arising in her again. Was this the man I just gave myself to? He finally managed to retort, "Well, what in the world are we going to do? Sit here and act like nothing happened? We just saw some lady disappear off the face of the planet." "Did you see who it was?" he said quietly, staring at the puzzle of bricks covering the building in front of them. "No," she answered, as she pulled on the ends of her hair in agitation. "I thought I recognized her for a moment, but then—" Angela trailed off and grunted, "Can't believe this." "Well, don't say anything about it, Angela. Let's just try to forget it." They were silent again in the car. Unsettled breathing started to fog the windows once more. Outside, brisk September wind blew. The wooded area behind the library seemed alive, the trees swaying against the evening sky. No clouds. A clear indigo backdrop against emerald leaves. The moon was brilliant, now white, its dark spots starkly contrasting as its light shone down on the earth. Angela gathered her book bag and opened the car door when Derek grabbed her hand. "Same time next week?" "I have no idea," Angela thought to herself. A wave of shame and guilt washed over her, as it did every time after every rendezvous. She knew it was wrong, the secretiveness, the dishonesty, yet this time she'd gone even further. "Can't believe I went all the way with him. Why did I go against everything I've been taught, everything I know is right? Derek, can't talk about that right now. Gotta go. Bye." She snatched her hand free from his, stepped quickly out of the car, and slammed the door. Angela headed to the back entrance and slipped inside the building, picking up a book from an aisle she passed, which had the sign "Educational" hanging above it. Walking quickly to the far side of the library, she passed a long line of computers where people sat studying or browsing, and then, crossing to the front desk, where the librarian stood, collecting books or helping patrons. The head librarian turned around as she saw Angela approach the desk. "Hello again, Angela. Did you get your studies completed?" "Hi, Miss Mark. Yes, I did." She pasted what she hoped was a normal smile on her face. "Here's the book I was studying. I was going to take it with me, but I think I have all the information I need from it." Angela held out the book, with no idea what the title was, and gave it to the stout woman. Nothing happened. Nothing happened. "Good. Tell your mother I can't wait to see her for prayer meeting and study tomorrow. Are you coming, dear?" "Not tomorrow. I have to do some tutoring at the junior high. I'll try to be there next week." Angela evaded. She'd been finding every excuse she could to avoid going to church during the week. There was no way she could escape going on Sunday. Her mother would never allow that. Since she had begun seeing Derek, Angela's interest in church activities had dwindled. She also hated the feeling that washed over her as she sat there. Guilt was a horrid thing. All right then, Angela dear, you're such a good girl. I know all about your academic accomplishments and your activities helping out at the junior high. Your mother sure raised a lovely, God-fearing child in this day and age. It seems that all the young people want to do is act as if they know everything and enjoy life without working for it. You're a sight for sore eyes, Angela. The Kind of Glorious Yes started playing. Angela nearly sighed aloud with relief as she pulled out her cell phone. One more accolade from Miss Mark, and she ran out the place screaming, "Hello?" She nodded quickly at Miss Mark, who smiled and waved her away. "Angela, I'm here." "I'm on my way out, Mama," Angela answered as she headed toward the glass doors. As she neared them, Derek came from the side aisle and stepped in behind her. As he leaned forward over her shoulder and pushed open the door, he whispered, "Remember, we didn't see anything." She nodded slightly as she walked out into the night air. Miss Mark switched off the lights throughout the library, except for the ones directly overhead at the front desk. She headed toward the back of the building to check that no one was remaining in the library and that everything was in order before locking up. All the displays of the computer terminals were set to the log-on screen, but as she scanned the line with her eyes, Miss Mark saw someone still sitting at a computer. She groaned. It must be one of the homeless people that came in off the street once in a while. "Excuse me, but you have to leave. The library is closed," she called out as she walked toward the individual. As she drew closer, a sudden stench rose in the air. It wasn't the typical drunk or unwashed scent with which she was familiar. It was the overpowering smell of blood. The coppery, unpleasant aroma arose in the air until she stopped walking and gagged, holding her hand over her nose. "What in the world?" she started to exclaim when she realized the individual was staring at her, eyes filled with a terrifying glee, illuminated by the blue screen of the computer. Miss Mark thought, in a rather odd way at a moment like this, that the image reminded her of when she was a girl and she or her friends would tell ghost stories in the treehouse, a flashlight under their faces to complete the eerie effect. Back then it had been childish fun. At the moment, though, it paralyzed her with fear. "You don't like my perfume?" A husky voice, which sounded like the tone of an old woman, spoke and then cackled. Miss Mark saw them suddenly, black splotches racing on the sides of the computers, darkening the screens as they squiggled across the displays, moving faster and faster over the chairs. Her field of vision widened, and she saw the walls were covered with these same splotches. They were all moving toward her. "Oh, no! Oh, no!" She started to scream as she turned, trying to run. It was too late. The black splotches enveloped her from above and below, covering her body in an instant, crawling into her mouth, choking off her voice. The film sheathed her, and the stinging pain began. Her body writhed back and forth in a grotesque dance. The old woman stood before her with an expression of sick pleasure as everything seemed to dissolve before her eyes. In her last moment of consciousness, Miss Mark heard a chilling, breathy voice say one word, "Mother." So that was the first chapter read of Dark Cherub. As I was reading that selection and looking back, I have to tell you, I feel very exposed because my mindset has changed drastically from that time of me being a first-time author to where I am today. So let me give you some behind the scenes of this particular book, Dark Cherub. I started writing this book in my teens, roughly about 17 or 18 years old. It was very different from what was eventually published, which would be about 10 years later. This is significant because I always tell people, just because it takes you a long time to finish your book, it doesn't mean you can't finish it. The point is to complete the work that God has given you. When I first wrote this book, I had no idea that Christian fiction existed. And this is very important. I used to read everything growing up. It didn't matter what it was. My parents didn't really monitor my reading. They were just glad to see me reading. So I was exposed to Stephen King. I was exposed to Robert McCammon. I was exposed to Janet Oki. I was exposed to lots of different writing styles growing up. So I thought I was going to do something different when I wrote my first book. The very first draft of Dark Cherub was actually it had a lot of swearing in it. It had a lot of sensuality in it. And it also had, I'm cringing now as I think about it, but it just had a lot of different things in it, that very first draft. And then when I discovered Christian fiction back in the year 2001 or 2002, I realized that I didn't have to write so heavy. And then I thought I was going to usher in Christian horror. I was going to be the trailblazer Christian horror, not knowing that Frank Peretti, Ted Dekker, and others had already come before me. So that's kind of some of the behind the scenes of this book. Some more behind the scenes is that this book was written at a time when I learned that the world I grew up in was a lot different than the world I entered when I became an adult. To give you an example, I was sheltered a lot growing up, and my parents were strict. I love my mom and dad, love them to death, but they were kind of strict growing up. Looking back, I don't know if that was a good thing or a bad thing. It's just something that it is, and we can't go back and say, I wish something had changed. We just tend to have to accept whatever life gives us and just make better choices or do better if we can. Having said that, though, when I went to college, I went to community college at first, it was shocking to me that there are people who did not believe in God. And everyone I had grown up with believed in God. And then I went to college and met people who didn't. It was very disconcerting at the time. I knew that these people existed, but I thought they were a rarity. I didn't think they were actually that many people who didn't believe in God, that didn't go to church. And there were other things that came to mind too. And this book comes from some of those experiences. Another thing, as I was reading that first chapter, my main character, Angela, is feeling guilty for having premarital sex outside of marriage. And this was something that was really big back during my childhood, which was the purity movement. And the purity movement unfairly put a lot of pressure on young girls. But this is what I grew up with. But in my instance, where some women have had these horror stories about purity culture, my parents basically told me, don't come home pregnant. That was basically what they told me. And so it lets me know that there was this idea of not having the appearance of sinning and the appearance of being holy, the appearance of it. Because now we see all these scandals that have rocked various church denominations in the last several years because people had the appearance of holiness but weren't really holy inside. And learning how to get away from the attraction of building a facade. That was one thing that was running through my mind as I was reading this first chapter. Now, the other thing too was that the guy who is the guy who becomes a major player in this story, he's actually a composite of two guys I used to like back in the day. One guy was a basketball player, and he had very lean muscles. He's very dark-skinned, smooth as milk chocolate, just darker. And whenever I looked at him and he would look at me, I remember being just drawn to his eyes. He had very compelling eyes. And then the other part of this guy, who is a major part, was another guy. And I had met a man who had green eyes. He was African-American, but he had green eyes. And that let me know about, mixed ethnicity. So I drew from my experience here too. Can't remember their names though. Isn't that awful? They were inspirational as part of the character, but I can't remember who they are now. And then, well, not who they are, but their names. Then the other thing was the library itself. When I was 18, I used to go to a university library all the time. And this is way back in the day before there were filters on the internet. Yes, I am that old. I can even remember accessing the internet when the internet was just a bunch of forums and a lot of text. So, but when I used to go to the library, there were huge terminal computers that we could use at the university. And people could come in off the street and use those computers. But what eventually happened, the university ended up creating a community section of maybe about 8 or 10 computers that the community could use, and they really were very strict about it. So that's where that comes from. And so there was a homeless guy who came into the computer room one day, and he was just sitting there using the computer. So that came from that experience as well. So as I was reading this, just a lot of things are coming to mind. I even know why I had my character act this way. And then, of course, she talks about going to church every day of the week. That's another thing from my childhood. We went to church all the time, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, all the time. And that's just what we grew up with. And good or bad, right or wrong, it is what it is. And I'm not saying that in a bad way. It's just something to think about. And I'm not the person I was when I first wrote this book. And that's why I feel so exposed. I feel like, wow, I really had different view of life back then. I heard a friend of mine say that authors are unable to keep themselves out of their own works. They may create characters that are different from their own worldview, but it's absolutely impossible to keep yourself out of your works. And reading that, wow, it just takes me back to my younger days and all the memories that go along with that. So yeah, those are some of the behind the scenes with that book. Another behind the scenes that I was very new to the author industry, and it was nothing then like it is now. It has exploded since 2010. And ebooks, I think ebooks had just come out around that time. The cover that my cover designer did for me, I ended up paying about $500 for that cover. And when she did that, I thought that was just the going rate. I didn't know that you can get cheaper covers, or I didn't even know to ask around. I knew she did graphic work, and she said, well, I haven't done a cover for a book before, but here's my fee. I'm going to do this for you. And I did. I liked the cover, but looking back, I would never have paid that much money. I wouldn't pay that much money now unless I absolutely had to. There was something really specific that I needed. And this is no shade on my cover design artist at all, because it was one of her first book covers too. So yeah, looking back, so that's some of the behind the scenes with Dark Cherub, some of my thought processes, how I've changed over the years. It's almost like looking at a completely different person when I was reading that. And I remember some of the things. As a matter of fact, I also remember the first time I wrote this, I actually said, inky black shadows, the width of a thread, wormed their way laterally across the concrete ground. That was the first sentence. There's also, throughout the story, there is a motif of the yellow moon. And that was inspired by the yellow moon I saw many years ago. It was brilliant and gold and beautiful, and was one of the inspirations for this story. So yeah, I don't want to ramble too much because it's my first time doing the first chapters behind the scenes with you. But I hope you enjoyed that. I really hope you enjoyed it. I hope you take something from it. I hope you're encouraged by it. And I'll be here next time with another first chapter read from one of my books. See you then.